Okay, so good morning, good
Good morning.
afternoon, good evening, good night, wherever you are in the world. I just want to tell you that I'm hosting Dr. Stuart Shanker in Georgia, in a little country in the Caucasian Mountains, in between Black and Caspian Seas. And I just want to celebrate this connection, celebrate the connection I have with you right now. And yeah, I just want to celebrate for everyone, for the Georgians, to connect with this historic person. I think it's a historic moment for me and for Georgians. So yeah, thank you so much for being with us right now.
This is wonderful.
So before I start asking questions, I just want to say what kind of influence you had on me and to introduce you to the auditory or the audience. Yeah. So you are the author of the famous and impactful quote that there's no such thing as a bad kid.
Yeah.
And you've seen kids who struggle and who were not in the right direction or were not on the good trajectory, but you know that there's always, there is always a way to change this trajectory and unlock, to potentiate the potential of every child and human being in the world. Yeah, so your works and your teachings were inspiration for me, and I founded my organization with my best friend, and the philosophy of your works of Self-Reg was the foundation, is the foundation of our work here in Georgia, and we want to create psychological freedom and neurophysiological safety for all human beings that we touch here in Georgia. So thank you so much.
That's wonderful.
Okay, so I will start with this kind of question. We've published your book, and I just want to show you here.
Yeah.
And
it's gorgeous.
Sold. Thank you so much. Oops. And the motto, and people helped me to publish this book. And so I want to thank all of them who supported me in this process. And the motto of publishing this book was, by helping us publishing this book, you are creating paradigm revolution. So I want you to tell us more. What is paradigm revolution, and how it is connected to Self-Reg?
So that is a term that comes from the philosophy of science. It was developed by a man called Thomas Kuhn. And the idea is that we're not just looking at, say, the opposite explanation of what's going on. We're developing a whole new way of thinking about children or thinking about ourselves. And with the paradigm revolution, you have all new kinds of questions and all new kinds of ways of answering them. But one of the most important aspects of a paradigm revolution for me is it doesn't mean that we suddenly discard all of the great scientific work that's been done over, say, the last 100 years. Instead, what we do is we reinterpret it. And one of the metaphors that always comes to my mind is someone can come along and sees an old mine, like a copper mine, which has been used up. And they look at it and they see that, in fact, there's a very different kind of material that's lying in this mine waiting to be exposed. And so what we do is we go back over these old theories and we suddenly discover there's incredible riches, provided we look at this work with different eyes, with a different conceptual lens. So that's what we're doing with the paradigm revolution. We're rediscovering the riches of the past and really discovering incredible new insights into what's going on with kids and what's going on with ourselves.
So it's like asking new questions, totally new questions.
Yes.
And really standing on the point where we can see differently the whole situation,
Yes.
circumstance.
Yes. Yes.
So I want to start with how was the writing process, or how is it for you to? So I want you to compare two different time periods. So when you wrote the book in 2016 and in 2021, talking about this book in this little country of Georgia. So what were your expectations and how it is all gathered or all seen right now from your eyes?
Okay, so there's different kinds of questions there. So let's see if I can break them down. I will tell you something I've never told anyone in an interview. It's very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
When I was 17 years old, my best friend got in trouble with the law, and in fact was sent to a juvenile prison. And his problem was he had tremendous stresses in his life and had become addicted to a drug that is similar to the opioid crisis today. And they put him in prison for this. I was devastated. And I stayed up that whole night and I wrote a manifesto. And my wife is very upset with me because I don't know where I put it. It's somewhere. But in the manifesto, what upset me was not only that he was so close to me, but he was an extraordinary young man, very, very clever. And I knew that his life had just been ruined. And in fact, his life was ruined by this experience. It was all so unnecessary. So I wrote this manifesto in which basically I started off and said that I wanted to dedicate my life to really fighting for this never happening to anyone again. And then I listed a bunch of questions for myself. What would I have to do? What would I have to learn in order to, fulfill this, in order to actually do this? So I had a series of different kinds of training that I thought would be necessary. So the first thing I wanted to do was philosophy, and that's what I did. I went to Oxford and I studied philosophy. And then I felt I needed training in psychiatry. And so I trained for 5 years under Stanley Greenspan, and that was very intense. I felt that I needed clinical experience working with children and families. So we were very fortunate. We got a large grant and created a clinical institute at my university where we could not just do therapy, but study the brain while we were doing it. So I was very methodical about, covering all the bases, if that makes sense to you. What were the different kinds of things you had to learn? And then I was approached by a literary agent who said, I had written a book in 2011 called Calm, Alert, and Learning. And this book, I had only done it as a favor to a publisher, but the book exploded. And none of us had expected it, but literally every single week there were new reprintings. And so a literary agent approached me and said, it's enough. You studied enough now. Now you have to write a book for parents everywhere. And that's why that's why I wrote the 2016 book with Teresa Barker. The last part of your question is a very interesting part. Why Georgia? Why was this so exciting for us, or for me? Georgia, so one of the driving one of the driving forces in my own thinking was planted in me by my father. My father was this incredibly strong advocate of freedom. My dad believed that freedom was the greatest gift that any human could enjoy. And I took that a step further and really started to work on psychological freedom. It's not enough to have political freedom if you are not psychologically free. And that was truly the lesson I had learned from my best friend when he got in trouble at the age of 17. He lacked psychological freedom. For us in the West, Georgia, over the last 30 years, has become this incredibly inspirational model of a country fighting to be free. And that's what Georgia represents for us, especially, you think about not just the initial independence of 1991, but, the wars, the bloodless wars of the 2000s. And I got excited because I thought I can add the psychological aspect of this nation that it has come to represent in the West, the struggle for true freedom. So that's why we got excited.
Yay. Thank you so much. It's so needed. And thank you for this tiny review of Georgia and the importance of freedom that we Georgians actually for so many years and centuries have been looking for. Thank you. Okay, I will start with the title of the book because I want to present this presentation to the parents and educators who bought this book and who will buy this book. And I want to start with the title. So in the title, you've written that Self-Reg is a way to help ourselves and our children to break the stress cycle. So my question is, like, what do you mean by stress cycle, or why is it important to break from it? Like, or how is it different from mainstream understanding of stress?
So I spent 10 years at the University of Oxford. And one of the things I was working on was something called homeostasis, which is really the theory about how an organism responds to stress. And so it was developed by physiologists, and it goes back to the middle of the 19th century and then was really instrumental at the beginning of the 20th century. And so this is all the work I was doing, and their view of stress was, and I'm thinking of people like Walter Bradford Cannon, their view of stress, and they invented the term, was anything that disrupts balance, anything that disrupts homeostasis. So I'll just give a very quick example. This is the example that Cannon gave. I don't know, in Tbilisi, do you have furnaces with forced air that keep your houses warm?
We have, it depends on the families, but we have, many families have it. And
okay, so I can use this as an example and people will know, like if I use the word thermostat, will people know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Okay, so in Cannon's model, you have a furnace to keep your house warm. And you have a thermostat set to keep the temperature, the average temperature in the house at 20 degrees, we'll say. And when it gets cold outside, this triggers the thermostat to go on. And when the house is warm, it triggers the thermostat to go off. So first point he had was we have that same kind of thermostat inside our brain. A little tiny part of the brain called the hypothalamus, which works like a thermostat. And it is carefully calibrated to keep our body temperature at 37 degrees roughly. Now, in his model, the cold temperature that causes the furnace to go on is a stress. So a stress the original definition of stress is anything that requires us to burn some of our internal fuel, our energy, in order to stay at 37 degrees. And the definition of a stress, the original definition, was anything that requires us to burn energy so that a system inside our body, say temperature, stays at 37, or that we keep the same amount of blood sugar, the same amount of glucose in our bloodstream, and so on and so on and so on. So when I came back to Canada, so that was the work I was doing. I came back to Canada in 1984, and people were asking me to talk about stress, and they had a totally different view, understanding what stress is from what I had been taught. They thought of stress as, you know, the sort of emotional stresses that we go through, which are stresses, or the stress of money, the stress of, you know, having to do too many things. Those are all stresses. But they had lost sight of the real meaning of stress. The real meaning of stress is that it makes us burn energy to stay healthy. So there's physical stress. There's what we call cognitive stress. These are different kinds of stresses that all require us, the brain, to burn energy. Now, here's the point that you were drawing. What we found was when someone is overstressed, say a child, it's never because of just one stress. It's never, and in fact, it's often not even the one you think. What happens is maybe they had real high physical stress in their lives, which was burning all their energy. So maybe, you know, they had, you know, the stress of noise, or the stress of too much visual stimulation. And so they're burning all this energy, and then they get exposed to another stress, an emotional stress, a social stress. But the tank is already empty. They've already used up all their energy with the other stresses, the physical ones, and they can't cope with this next level of stress. And so what happens is the next stress, say the emotional one, makes them break down. And we think, oh, well, that was the problem. The problem was they can't handle the emotional stress. But in fact, what we find is it was the whole total complex of stress that was involved here. And to help that child, this is what we did at our clinic, to help that child, we had to figure out all of the stresses. We had to reduce all of the stress load, and not just the one that we thought was the problem. Over and over, we found the same thing. If we looked at the entire stress cycle, all of the stresses the kid was under, and we reduced that entire stress load, they could start to handle things that before they were getting them into trouble.
So yeah, I think Self-Reg distinguishes between the stressors between 5 domains that
Yes.
People will read. But I think what it gives us is this understanding of complexity, that it's not one thing that
That's well put.
causes something.
That's well put.
So, yeah, digging deeper, and it's the whole process.
That's really, really well put. But
it's like the Self-Reg gives us this curiosity and wonder, you know, and we get it.
That's great.
Not daunting. Like you see, wow, I can see right now. And then I think you've said it in other interviews or podcasts, but like, I think what Self-Reg teaches us is to have this glasses or some mechanism that scans beyond the surface, like, you know, the dopamine surge, or heart rate is increased, the voice. So
That's great.
Really take us.
That's really great.
Put our focus on the deeper stuff.
That's really great.
Can you just, before I ask another question that I had already prepared, can you just tell us what does it mean that the kid has that the child's behaviors or child breaks down? Like, what are some, how can we know that our child is overstressed, like is caught in the stress cycle?
Okay, so there's two questions there, both of them important. So the first one is, how do you know when the child has broken down, is dysregulated, it's called? Well, the child has a tantrum. The child won't listen, becomes withdrawn, or the child is miserable. So, so every parent knows, not just when the child is broken down, but every parent we've found knows when it's going to happen. Every parent has this intuitive sense that, uh-oh. So we do in fact know. I once did a session with a group of educators who asked me to talk about explosive behaviors. And what they meant by that was this, say, tantrum that comes out of nowhere. So there isn't such a thing. And so we spent the day talking about it. And I said, okay, now I want you all to give me an example of that kid who, these are older kids, these are primary schools, so children 6 to 12 years old. So I said, give me an example. Okay, now when he came into school that day, did your antenna tell you, uh-oh, this is going to be a hard day? And they always had this intuitive sense that, maybe his eyes were, down, or he put his hoodie over his head. There's always signs, but we ignore it. We block it out. So one of the things we're striving for is in Self-Reg. The fifth step of Self-Reg is called restore. And what we want to do is we want to restore balance in the brain, in the body, before we have these outbreaks. And so we learn to read the various kinds, they're called limbic signs or limbic cues, that the child is overstressed. We all of us have a sort of intuitive sense. If we know a child, we have this intuitive sense that this is a sign that the child is overstressed. What we're doing is making that knowledge explicit, conscious, that now I know that this is a little guy that's struggling. What is his tone of voice like? What is his facial complexion like? And then I can reduce the child's stress load way before we have that meltdown.
To sum up what you said is, or just to add a little more, is that Self-Reg actually teaches us and gives us permission to trust our
That's great. That's great.
To follow it. Yeah.
That's great.
Very important.
That's really great.
Okay, so
can I add one thing to that, Nino?
Sure.
And also to be kind to yourself, because we have to factor in our own stress load. And so in the book, in the 2016 book, I give some examples of occasions where I lost it as a father. I could, if anyone could be upset with themselves, it's me, because I write books about this. But so we learn not just to read the signs in the child, but to recognize that our own stress, our own life has a huge bearing on how well we can respond, and to forgive ourselves, to be kind, compassionate with ourselves.
True. It works. And
yes.
It's a very compassionate, as well as giving us agency.
Yes.
Not only feeling,
perfect.
Not only feeling, but also acting.
Perfect.
Okay, could we talk more precisely about one of the hidden stressors? So, Self-Reg, you separate the you actually emphasize on hidden stressors that actually burns energy that we even don't know that it affects us. So any type of super stimulants, maybe, like, yeah, whichever you want to choose, but to let us to have a deeper understanding of why, for example, screens or junk food are stressors.
So this is a huge point. And you know, when we start to do self-reg with parents, we do something, you know, we want them to become stress detectives. And so we have them do this exercise where they start to write down the stresses in their children's lives. And so they'll write down the obvious stresses, you know, kids at school, or, you know, the stress of exams, whatever. And then the next step is we want to introduce them to this idea of hidden stresses. Mm-hmm. This is always a breakthrough for parents, because they hadn't realized that something can be draining their child's energy, and they had no idea. And what made me, what really brought this home to me was a study done in Sweden about 10 years ago now. And they were looking at the effect of violent video games on adolescent boys. And what they found was, so the lesson that the instruction that they gave to parents was, you must turn off the game at 10 p.m. so the child goes to sleep. Mm-hmm. And then they studied the child's nervous system for the entire night. So what they wanted to know was the effect of the violent video game over the next 6 hours, even though the child was sleeping. What they found was that, okay, so turn off the computer, child goes to sleep, but their nervous system was working like crazy, burning energy, because, you know, the part of a child's brain that's watching this game doesn't realize it's a very ancient part of the brain, and it doesn't realize it's a game. For this primitive part of the brain, this is real. So the enemy soldiers, or the movie, or the vampire, these are real. And this part of the brain is called the limbic system. It's a very ancient system. Now, if this was a real threat, then that limbic system, especially a little part of the brain called the amygdala, would stay alert, would stay vigilant for many hours, just in case the danger came back. So what had happened, what is happening is that the child goes to sleep, and this part of the brain, the front part of the brain, goes to sleep, but the amygdala, the limbic system, does not. It is waiting for that danger to come back, the vampire to come back, the soldier to come back. And what that means for parents is that while the child is sleeping, the heart is beating very high. The blood pressure has gone up. The child's, it's called sympathetic arousal. And the child's sympathetic arousal has remained very high, just in case the vampire comes back or the soldier. And so what happens is, you know, I started off talking to you about stress as anything that requires us to burn energy. Mm-hmm. So here's a case where the stress was the vampire. That keeps the internal system burning energy for many hours, even though the kid's asleep. Mm-hmm. Then what happens is the child wakes up the next day, and guess what? This child now has trouble going to school. This child now has trouble paying attention in class, because paying attention requires energy, but he used up all his energy during the sleep. So what we found when we started to really dig deep into this is there are many examples, like the example you gave of a super stimulant. In this case, it might be a sweetened soft drink. These are things that keep the internal systems burning an awful lot of energy without parents noticing, without us knowing that's happening. And then the next day is when we see problems in behavior or problems in learning. And it's because of these hidden stresses. And once you recognize what they are and remove them or reduce them, it's quite extraordinary how behavioral problems really diminish.
Yeah, thank you for explaining, like for reframing this and actually
reframing. Yes.
Yeah, thank you for that. And so I will just go from here to the calmness. So it means that kids or adolescents or us, the adults, are hyper aroused most of the time.
Yes, that's exactly it.
So we've lost
exactly it.
We forgot, or some kids even haven't learned what it means to be calm.
Yes,
and
exactly right.
It was from your book when I first understood and felt what calmness is. So could you tell us more about calmness? And maybe I'll add a little, why is it important to stay calm or to share our calmness even today, like in this pandemic?
So I love the question. One day at our research institute, so we had a clinical team. So one day the therapist came in and said, Stuart, we have a video we need you to see. Okay, so they sit me down and they show me this video, and it's a TV show that had become very popular. And it was a woman who claimed to be a behavioral expert. And she was going around, she would go into families where there was a child that was having trouble. And she would use, can I use a term like behaviorist, and that's okay? And she would use behaviorist techniques to extinguish the behavior that the child was demonstrating that was upsetting the parents. So the example in the video that the girls gave me was, it was a 5-year-old child and she was having meltdowns. And what this behavioral expert did was she took the child and put her on what she called a naughty stool. And she literally held the child's, arms until the child ceased struggling. So I'm looking at this like, because this was a very popular TV show and it was shocking to me. And the child stopped struggling and the child became very passive, very submissive. And then the final part of the show was, you see, this is all the child needed, just a bit of discipline in order to calm down. Okay. Now, this was shocking because the child was not calm. The child had actually gone into a very different state. The combination of, she was already overstressed. And by the way, this was a child that had sensory challenges. She had a very low sensory stress threshold. The combination of being scared and being restrained had sent her into what we call a state of parasympathetic flooding is what it's called. And it's basically freeze. We had fight, flight, freeze. And the child was in freeze. And you can look at this and here they were saying, now she's calmed down. But if you hooked her up, and we did this, if you hook that child up to your the various ways we measure arousal, and you use a very important term, hyperarousal. We can measure hyperarousal we use little heart monitors, or we have little things on the skin. These are all ways for us to see how much energy is being spent, that's the problem with hyperarousal. And what you discover is in a state of freeze, that child's hyperarousal is burning energy like crazy.
Mm-hmm.
So there's this huge distinction that we draw in Self-Reg between being calm and being quiet, being still. So how do we define calmness? Exactly in the way you just explained. So when a child is calm, that arousal comes down. The tension comes down. We can measure, and we do measure, arousal in different ways. So we measure arousal in terms of the heart, how much the heart is beating. We measure it in terms of breathing, how fast you're breathing. We also measure arousal in what's going on inside the brain. It's called cortical arousal. When a child is calm, all of these kinds of arousal, so cortical arousal, physiological arousal, emotional arousal, they all come down. Why is this so, now the last part of your question, why is this so important? Because when the arousal comes down, they stop burning energy. In fact, something else happens. So I won't go into details here, but the very short explanation is there is a sort of switch in the brain, in the front part of the brain. And when a child is calm, I'll just use the technical term, okay? Because it's called the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, the VMPFC. When a child is calm, that part of the brain switches on. And that part of the brain, it can't go on when the kid's hyper-aroused. But when the child is calm, in the way I've explained, it switches on. And now a whole bunch of things happen. Cellular repair, the immune system, digestion, all of these incredible restorative functions kick in. So calmness is absolutely huge. Now, how do we get to calm? How do we get a child, especially a kid like my 17-year-old friend, how do I get a child to that state where they can be genuinely calm as opposed to, and that's what Self-Reg is. The first 3 steps of Self-Reg, reframing a child's behavior, recognizing what the different stresses are, hidden as well as overt, reducing the stresses, they are steps to getting to calm. The first 3 steps get the child into calm. That's the 4th step. And then the 5th step is what do we do to restore, whatever that means.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. I just want to ask you about the COVID. You know, like I was thinking that COVID has removed many hidden stressors. You know, we could not gather together, you know, crowds or, I don't know, shopping malls were closed, you know, all the flights and everything was closed. However, we still are overstressed. So how is Self-Reg viewing it, the COVID pandemic?
So it's a great question. It's an important question. I had to do a big presentation last week about this issue. I'm not sure who I did that for. Heather could tell you. But basically, we have gotten some data just in now.
Wow.
And the data has told us that the incidence of anxiety disorders or depression in children and teens has tripled over the last 12 months. So this is a huge crisis.
Yeah.
And it's a real one. This is a huge stress on society, a huge stress on parents, a huge stress on kids. And one of the aspects that we talk about in the 2016 book is a child's brain, when they reach the age of around 10, is really programmed to handle stress with other children, with peers. And so there's a big change that's going on in the adolescent brain where it needs peers more than parents to manage the stresses in their lives. But now with COVID, that has been blocked. There is, there's obvious signs that social media or FaceTime, whatever, can help, but it's not the same. And so the question then is, what am I supposed to do if I'm a parent and I see that my child is overstressed and I know why? What can I do about it? And the answer is, there's no simple answer, but the answer is that, for one thing, we need to explore how they can continue to have social interactions with close friends that are safe. But the brain also allows us as parents to fill that missing piece, to step in, to be that source of stress management that the child can't handle on their own. So it's called social engagement, and a parent can do this even when it's a grown-up child, even when it's an adult. However, to perform this function, the parent has to be calm themselves. You cannot do it if you're overstressed. So the big lesson here appears to be that the emphasis on self-reg has to be on the word self. First, we work on our own self-regulation in order to be that source of calmness. And we talk in Self-Reg about lending our calmness to the child. If we are calm, then then the child absorbs limbically that calmness. So that's where we are in our own thinking.
And I think it really smoothly goes with my next question, because you were telling that in your teachings that we prioritize language after 3 years, when the kid is 3 years old. And so my question is, why is it important to have this limbic to limbic communication? Why should we learn to speak limbic throughout our life?
So we noticed this in pretty much every single family that we worked with. So they would come in when the child was 2 years old, 2.5 years old, and would be very regulating. And then the child began to speak at around, we'll say, the age of 3. I mean, there's, language comes in bits and pieces, and perceptions changed. And all of a sudden, parents became very, what we call, self-controlist. And by that, what we mean is, the child now speaks, so they should understand this is the rule, and these are the consequences that if you break that rule. So then I got very interested in this, and I started to read anthropology on child development around the world. And it turns out that pretty much every culture, I remember reading this book called Never in Anger, which was about the Inuit in the far north of Canada. And they had exactly the same thing, exactly the same, the child is now speaking, so they should understand, they need to understand that if they break these rules, they will pay the price, they will be punished or whatever. But the problem is that when a child, I will use the term you introduced before, when a child is hyper aroused for whatever reason, one of the things that happens in the brain is that the part that processes language, the part that understands what you're saying, shuts down. So if they're hyper aroused, they don't understand. They are not truly processing what the parent is saying. Well, what are they processing? They're processing things like the parent's tone of voice, the look in the parent's eyes, the parent's posture. When a child is hyper aroused, the language function is basically reduced, and instead they are attending to your limbic cues, The things that if you're angry or irritated or exasperated, these messages are sent to the child through your eyes, through your tone of voice. And that's what the child is processing. Now, to reverse that, which is what you did in your question, I can have a teenager, and the teenager is saying something outrageous. We know that they've done something bad, and the kid keeps saying, I don't care, I don't care, I don't care. And you can take that as a parent, you can take it literally. You should care. You should. And what we're going to do is we're going to increase the punishment so that they care. But what we learn in Self-Reg is to ignore the language, the words, and listen to the limbic message. And what the child is telling us is, I'm really scared. I don't feel I have any control. And all I want to do is escape. All I want to do is flee. And the teenager saying, I don't care, I don't care, is like a little kid who's trying to just run away.
Yeah.
And so what do is when we work with parents, and we have cases like this in the book, when the child's saying this, instead of trying to force them to care, what we do is we reduce the stress. We stop. In fact, if you stop talking, that's often a very good way to start. Stop talking and just let everything calm down. There will be a time for talking, but not in this moment.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. I will ask you the final question.
Okie doke.
So because you have so much knowledge and you have so much experience, from, as you've told in the beginning of our interview, I'm just wondering what is on your mind right now? Like what one thing or several things pop up in your head at night when you go before sleeping, or what are you trying to solve or think about?
Two things. Okay. The first thing is we are seeing an epidemic of polarization throughout the world. Now, polarization is actually the sign of a whole society that has become overstressed. A whole society which has gone, in Self-Reg, we call it red brain. So these are societies that have gone red brain. And so my response to a society is the same as my response to a teenager who's gone red brain. You do not solve polarization by shouting at the other side. Rather, what we do is we have to lower the stress load on our society. We have to figure out, why is our society so overstressed? Mm-hmm. And we're going to be, in Self-Reg, we always ask two questions: why and why now? I found myself this morning, I got up early and was reading the American papers, and it would be very easy to become upset about what happened in the US yesterday, which is yet another sign of deep polarization. But instead I asked why and why now? What are the stresses that they are dealing with? And then, you stop and think, oh my goodness, they had 4,000 deaths from COVID yesterday, just yesterday. That's a huge stress right there. They've got, and you start to think about it, and your own anxiety comes down, and you start to think about, what can I do to reduce the stress levels, maybe not of America, but of my own family or my own community or my own country? Mm-hmm. And the second part of my what do you wake up, Stuart, thinking about is we have been overwhelmed by self-reggers like you around the world. Okay, so what we had to create a new organization, Self-Reg Global, so that we could deal with all the Ninos. And what I realized is you reach a certain point in your own life or your own career where you don't matter anymore. And now the ones who matter are the Ninos. They are the, and I'm very serious. And if you think about what you said at the very beginning, before we started, talking about the work that you're doing with your organization, with your partner, this is how change happens. So what we want now is, you said something else early on. This is about giving every single parent now, we're all the same. We're all worried about our children. We're all worried about our parents. And we need to give them hope. And the hope that they need comes from understanding what you said at the start. We can always change a trajectory. Okay? And so now it's not my time anymore. Now it's your time. Now you're the ones that have to do this. And I applaud you.
Thank you so much. Like, I'm honored. I feel humbled, and actually, I see what you mean. And I was thinking that it is this moment of our connection is not some magical moment. It's the normal progression of what you did and what I've been thinking. And yeah, suddenly we have connected, and
yes.
Now it's that it just.
This is how I feel.
Yeah. So
don't get tired.
No. I'm just getting more excited. I just wanted to share people who are getting the books. They have so much anticipation and excited, and they really like, this book is my hope. So I'm just like,
that's
okay.
What we want.
Yeah. And I just want to reduce their stress of reading this book by having a book club. And so we can just,
love it. I love it. I just love it.
So yeah, we move on, and thank you so much. Thank you so much. It was very lovely, and I felt safe being with you. Thank you.
Okay, keep it up, Nino. We'll check in again in a couple of months, okay?
Yeah, okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Goodbye, sweetheart.
Thank you.